Our primary mission here at Alternate Media is to bridge the gap between Judaism and Christianity, as it's existed for far too long. Yeshua, as we know, never intended to start a new religion. He was a religious Jew.
I think it's a certain point in every believer's life where we think, isn't there more?
There has definitely been a need within the church. It's something that a lot of Christians are searching for. A lot of Christians know that there is something missing in their faith. And what indeed is intended to fill that is Judaic roots of the faith.
The New Testament is very clear about bridging the gap between Jew and Gentile, and we're just returning that mission back to the modern day. What's up, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Altered Podcast, Deck the Halls with Dogmatism, as we talk about tons of Christmas stuff coming up. As you can still see, I'm still in the process of moving, so please forgive the boxes and the clutter. We're getting there. It's been a long couple of weeks, but anyway, we've got quite a show for you today. I hope you brought a notebook and a drink because you're going to need it. So without further ado, let me go ahead and bring on the man of the hour, Brad. Let me go ahead and switch these back. There we go. That's more proper. How are you today, sir?
I am doing well. Just finishing up on one last banner, and this one I'm pretty excited for, actually, because this is kind of what this whole series has been leading up to, and it's been a lot of work, but it's been educating, satisfying, and I've actually learned quite a bit about a few other topics through doing this project. So, yeah, I'm very excited about what we've got in store for tonight.
Yeah, tonight's the main event. Every part has been leading up to this, and we've got quite a bit to cover, actually, as we were talking about backstage. So once again, everybody, I hope you brought a notebook, and I hope you brought a drink. Speaking of drinks, sir, who do you have joining with us tonight in spirits?
So I ended up having to pass through Savannah and went ahead and got a bottle of the Savannah bourbon for myself. So I will be having that tonight in honor of my grandfather. The reason we had to go to Savannah, my grandfather passed, and so we'll be drinking this in honor of him tonight.
God rest his soul. And well, for me, I'm having an old fashioned that I made for myself using Basil Hayden dark rye.
Ooh,
yeah.
Basil Hayden,
very good old fashioned.
Always a good choice.
I love a good dark rye too, and an old fashioned is it's a perfect drink.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Now, question: when you make an old fashioned with rye, do you add bitters?
Yes.
Yep. I go light on bitters when I'm using a rye because rye is already bitter.
So I'm sort of the other way. I go lighter on the simple syrup because I want the bitterness of the rye to shine through, and so I don't want that sugary, to cloud over it. So yeah.
I gotcha.
Yeah. Same general concept though. Like you want the spiced rye in there.
Yes, of course, absolutely.
So just before we get started, a couple of things, of course. Welcome to the show. If you haven't already, hit the like button, believe in the subscribe button. It's the easiest and freest way to support us, and we really appreciate all your guys' support here. Thanks again for joining us tonight, and if you are so inclined and you would like to donate to the cause, we are a 501c3 organization, tax deductible. And so if you would like to contribute in any way, you can go to our website at alternatemedia.com. That's ALTARNATE media.com. You can support us on Patreon with the patreon.com/alternate media. Same tag. We prefer the website. And for your troubles, you have access to a bunch of exclusive content and early access to other things as we release them before they show up here. And tons of other perks. Go check it out. But thank you all of you guys for all of your support. And we will be hanging out with all our supporters after the show, actually. So if you haven't done that yet, you should join us in the Discord. Even if you're not a supporter financially, the Discord's cool anyway. We got a lot of stuff going on there. There's a lot of ways to participate, and we hang out in the Discord quite often. And for those of you who are supporters, we do the after parties where we chill out after show, and you can talk with us. You can hang out in awkward silence with us, ask us questions, put us to the lion's den, whatever you want to do. It's your time. We do that for about an hour after the show. Okay, so that does it for all of our pre-show announcement stuff. I think it's time we just jump right into the topic. So why don't you kick us off there, my guy?
Yeah. So when it comes to this topic, and I'm looking for a particular date right now. It's irrelevant. When it comes to this topic, this discussion, so far what we've covered has been the origin of birthday celebrations in the pagan world, how the early Jewish world viewed them, and going into how the early Christian world viewed them and how they ultimately came to celebrate them. That was part one. Part two, we went over the myriad of different calculations that went into trying to guess what the actual date of Yeshua's birth was. Part three, we went over the origin of real, actual Christmas celebrations, right? How far back could we actually track legitimate citations that actually speak of celebrations or observances? So tonight we will be going over kind of the history of the idea that Christmas is pagan. Because one of the things that I've seen floating around in the rather dogmatic approach that some who have recently come by the calculations theory have spouted is the idea that this is a new notion, right? That this is a recent conspiracy theory. Matter of fact, some even go around to throw the name, and I'll go ahead and our first banner here. They will blame Alexander Hislop and his book, The Two Babylons. Okay, so The Two Babylons is a book that Alexander Hislop wrote. It was actually more of a pamphlet in 1853. Many people have read this book. Many people have come to the conclusion because of this book that Christmas is pagan. And to go ahead and give those who hold to the calculations theory some of the credit that's due them, there is a lot of false information in this book. Okay. And to go ahead and at least grant in the name of good faith, some of the theories floating around about the origin of Christmas that there actually isn't that much scholarly basis for, right? There really isn't much evidence to support. That would be one of the more popular ones, and this may actually offend some people, but there really isn't a connection between Christmas and Mithras. At least none that predate what we can establish as Christmas celebrations. So far as we can tell, Christmas was being celebrated before we can make any real connection of Mithras to December 25th. That's actually something that we find later in history. We know that the cult of Mithras was around. Some, and this is again in the dogmatic approach, a lot of times the information presented is less than accurate, or at least not 100% accurate. Many people will trace the cult of Mithras back to Roman religion. It does not originate in Rome. It's actually a Persian cult, and Romans got it from Persia when they overtook that region. But so far as we can tell from ancient Zoroastrian texts and from ancient Persian texts, we can't actually derive a birth date on December 25th from those texts. We don't find anything that actually correlates Mithras' birth to December 25th until after Christmas is already being observed by Christians. So just to grant that, right, in the name of good faith.
But it might be worth pointing out that Roman syncretism,
Right.
eventually Mithras is the subject of Sol Invictus at a certain point.
That is the best way to go about this. Is if you do diligent research in the cult of Mithras, you will find that ultimately Mithras and Sol became synonymous with one another. Okay,
eventually.
They were ultimately seen as being the same god. So if you can prove, which we can, that Sol Invictus was recognized on December 25th, then so was Mithras, right? That's easily provable. But you have to jump into Sol Invictus. You can't make that correlation directly from Mithras on its own. You really have to do a deep dive into these faiths to make the connection first of Mithras with Sol Invictus. It's actually interesting when you go that far. Ultimately, what you find is something that would very much resemble a trinity, because the divine mother, divine father, and divine child in this cult narrative ultimately were seen as being somehow synonymous with one another in some cases. So it just an interesting point on that.
No, we're really side-eyeing other topics right over here.
And the next one here, and again, this with some caveats, okay? At face value, and we'll go further into detail on this, but just at face value, I will acknowledge there seems to be no direct connection between Saturnalia and Christmas and December 25th. Okay. This one I'm excited to go more into later, but we'll get to that in a moment, because there's a particular person and a particular citation involved where this becomes a relevant conversation. But for now, right, Saturnalia was not held on December 25th. Okay. We can go ahead and just put that out there again in the name of being consistent with the information that we're presenting. And some of this is the information that is presented in Alexander Hislop's The Two Babylons. Okay. One of the things that most scholars will point out about Alexander Hislop's The Two Babylons is that he offers no primary sources, and he actually doesn't really give that many citations for any of the information that he is putting out. So it seems to some like he just made it up. And that is why many will point back to Alexander Hislop in the mid-1800s when it comes to the history of the belief that Christmas has pagan origins. That's actually what we're here to dispel right now, because it's simply not true. The notion that Christmas having pagan origins is a recent idea is historically untenable. So let's go a little ways back into history, into a little further into church history, to find some of the first evidences that might point to there being a level of pagan influence on the celebration of Christmas. So one of the first evidences, and this is one that calculation theorists are aware of, and they have an argument for it, but I think the argument that they make regarding this misses the point. We have the writings of Tertullian on idolatry, specifically on idolatry chapter 10, where Tertullian acknowledges that, or he's admonishing Christians against taking part in the celebration of heathen festivals. He also specifies idols' birthdays in this. And he says that on these days, every pomp of evil is frequented. Okay, so we're already seeing some indication of, again, what early Christmas celebrations would have looked like, which is why they were ultimately outlawed in early America. We'll get to that in a little bit later. But so Tertullian is preaching against Christians practicing these pagan festivals. And that is what the calculation theorist will point out, right? Is that he's preaching against it. So you can't use this as evidence that Christmas is pagan, or that Christians were taking part in paganism. I would argue the opposite. And this is something that Dr. Justin Sledge said when we had him on. The fact that the early church fathers are ranting against Christians celebrating pagan festivals means that Christians were celebrating pagan festivals. You don't have to tell somebody not to do something that they aren't doing, right? Matter of fact, you don't have to be so mean about it as Tertullian is, unless they're doing it a lot. So we already have evidence here and acknowledgement of Christians taking part in pagan festivals. Now, this is actually a less direct example because he really only is admonishing them against it. There isn't really a direct claim to them taking part in it. We don't get that until later in the same work on idolatry, chapter 19. Mm-hmm. This is where Tertullian blatantly acknowledges that Christians frequent the Saturnalia and a number of other pagan festivals. So we already know that by the point in time that Tertullian is around, that Christians are taking part in pagan festivals. Matter of fact, it's a large enough problem that Tertullian feels the need to write about it.
And he's not the only one, but we'll get to that.
Right, he's not the only one. And it's a big enough problem that he feels the need to write about it. And the ironic part is that very shortly after this, we have Christmas.
Mm-hmm.
Right, that again, it's not a smoking gun, but it's like, all right, we have a problem of Christians celebrating pagan holidays. And then very shortly after, we have this Christian holiday that has no historical precedence prior to this point, and suddenly Christians celebrating the pagan holidays seems not to be so much of a problem anymore.
I wouldn't even say suddenly, although we don't have a lot of, there's sort of a dark period between 211 and like 375. But between 211 and 375, the problem of pagan holiday celebration seems to suddenly disappear around the winter solstice times, strangely enough. But we're going to get to that.
Right. And let's see. The exact quote from Tertullian here is, he is actually contrasting Christianity to Judaism. Because he actually begins by contrasting how the Jews have the Sabbath, right? And they have a very strict observance for the Sabbath and their holy days. So it says, by us to whom Sabbaths are strange, right? So this is the point at which Christians were beginning to move away from Sabbath observance, right? Or at this point really had moved quite a ways from Sabbath observance.
Yeah. Yeah.
He says, so by us to whom Sabbaths are strange, and the new moons and festivals formerly beloved by God, the Saturnalia and New Year's and midwinter's festivals and Matronalia are frequented. Presents come and go, New Year's gifts, games join their noise, banquets join their din. So in contrast to Jews celebrating biblical holidays, he's acknowledging that Christians are now celebrating pagan holidays. Again, not a smoking gun, but this is admission that Christians were taking part in pagan practice. That is inarguable at this point.
Yeah, it's like, once again, we keep saying not a smoking gun, but it's really suspect. It's very sus. Just the descriptions alone, when you read them, you're like, wow. Okay. I mean, technically not, but very sus. Yeah.
I was going to say, I know you had something. Is this the point at which you wanted to go over that, or?
Sure. With the Tertullian thing, well, he brings up, this is actually, I'm sourcing this from an article Tim Hegg wrote in 1994, called Why I Don't Celebrate Christmas. And I was browsing through it today. I'd read it a long time ago, but before the show, I was like, oh yeah. So I was just reminded of it and decided to go back through it a little bit. He quotes Tertullian here from his treatise on idolatry, although he doesn't specify the chapter exactly, but he makes note that the evergreen decorations are being admonished by him in part of the way that they are behaving. And so evergreens are made mention as part of the decorations. So once again, Tertullian has a whole document that's rather lengthy on idolatry, and he just sits there and berates Christianity for being too syncretic with these things. And many of the things that he mentions are stuff that happens in the midwinter, right around or on the solstice, with Roman holidays, doing the things that they do, the exchanging of gifts, decorating with evergreens. Like, again, not a smoking gun, really suspicious.
So our next example comes much later in church history, about 160, 170 years later, almost. But that would be Epiphanius. Now, Epiphanius is one that scholars today will say that he was incorrect in his observation, and I say observation for a very specific reason. Some assume that he was trying to ascertain or make a guess at the celebration of Saturnalia, and that his guess was incorrect, right? That he was incorrect that Saturnalia was celebrated on December 25th. And again, so far as we can tell from what we know of the history of Saturnalia, that is true. So the exact quotation comes from, thank you for pulling that up, comes from his Panarion, right? Refutation of All Heresies, chapter 4, 22, 5, and 6, or book 4, chapter 22, 5, and 6. The exact quote is, Greeks, I mean idolaters, celebrate this day on the 8th day before the calends of January, December 25th, which Romans call Saturnalia. For this division between signs of zodiacs, which is a solstice, comes on the 8th day of the calends of January. And the day begins to lengthen because the light is receiving its increase, and it completes a period of 13 days until the 8th day before the Ides of January, January 6th, the day of Christ's birth. So first thing to note here, he's actually acknowledging that Yeshua was born on January 6th, not December 25th. But he also says here that the Romans call this day Saturnalia. And again, most will simply say, okay, well, he was just incorrect about that, because we know, right, what we can determine from historical sources. What we know, point in fact, is that Saturnalia never fell on December 25th, right? That's the argument. And this is one of those topics that you can determine either the level of education or the level of intellectual honesty based on when they will say Saturnalia did take place. Okay? And I do say both because some people are just ignorant, but some people are directly omitting information. Okay? If they tell you that Saturnalia took place on December 17th, they are either ignorant, right? And they have not, they're not wrong, but they are ignorant because they're not giving you full information, and it may be because they don't know the full extent of the information. Or the other option, they're being directly intellectually dishonest because they do know the other information, but they know that it can actually be perceived as detrimental to their position.
Yeah,
because Saturnalia began in a period long before the time of Christ, where we're going BC days, several hundred years, began, and it was on December 17th. It, throughout history, became extended 3 times, okay? it extended from a one-day festival to 3 days, so 17th, 18th, and 19th. Then it became extended to 5 days, so from December 17th to December 21st. And then it became extended to 7 days, from December 17th to December 23rd. Okay? Now, again, if the person that you are having a discussion with about this topic gives you that information and they tell you, look, Saturnalia was not on December 25th. It was from the 17th to the 23rd. You know what? Good on them. They're being intellectually honest. They're at least giving you that information.
24th, by the way. 7 days after the 17th would be the 24th.
Right. Okay. So, yeah. I mean, well, not a Hebrew calendar, though. So you're counting the 17th.
Well, we're talking about a Roman calendar, though.
Be that as it may, the argument that we'll make is that it's still not the 25th.
Right. But it's a common mistake to make.
Right.
Yeah.
It's still not the 25th. So sure, we'll grant that. I still don't think that Epiphanius was incorrect. I think that he was making an observation, right? What he was observing is that on the 25th, people were celebrating Saturnalia. Do we have a historical basis for that? Well, it turns out that we do. I did not make a banner for this. So for those of you who want this citation, you're going to have to write it down as I say it. But you will find there are multiple sources for it, but there are two that are very easy to find. In Mishnah Avodah Zarah 1:2, so 1:2, and then also in the Jerusalem Talmud Avodah Zarah 1:1, we find where Rabbi Yishmael says, on 3 days before the festivals of the Gentiles and on 3 days after them, it is prohibited to engage in business with those Gentiles. And the rabbis say it is prohibited to engage in business with them before their festivals, but it is permitted to engage with them after their festivals. So this is where we're going to see that there's a disagreement, and there's the discussion continues on. But the point here is that initial statement from Rabbi Ishmael, where he says that 3 days before and 3 days after, it's forbidden to do business with Gentiles. Now, he doesn't give a reason here, but if you go to, there is also a what's called explanation on Mishnah. It explains this statement, and it gives two reasons. It says, but the sages say before their festivals it is forbidden, but after their festivals it is permitted. Rabbi Ishmael states that not only is it forbidden to make transactions with non-Jews during the 3 days before their pagan holiday, but it is also forbidden during the 3 days following their pagan holiday. In the Palestinian Talmud, two potential reasons are given for Rabbi Ishmael's statement. The first is that non-Jews continue to celebrate for 3 days after their holidays are over, and therefore these 3 days are also forbidden. The second is that if the non-Jew knows that he will not be able to conduct business with the Jew after his holiday, he will be depressed during his holiday, and he will engage in less idol worship. So what that tells us is this. Even if Saturnalia does not fall on the 25th, this time period, a Jew would still be forbidden to do business with that Gentile, even on the 25th, because on the 25th, that Gentile would still be celebrating Saturnalia.
This sort of translates even into the modern day. After Christmas morning, it doesn't just suddenly disappear. You kind of have that, sort of Christmas spirity vibe all the way up until right about New Year's, and then it kind of shifts a little bit more towards the New Year. But it's more of it's a whole month. Christians celebrate Advent for an entire month leading up to Christmas Day. So, yeah, and that citation with Mishnah Avodah Zarah 1:2. What was the Jerusalem Talmud? Avodah Zarah
1:1.
1:1.
Yes.
1, 2. And that would be chapter 1, Safim 2, right?
Yes.
All right. So I was putting one here for.
There we go.
The I just wanted to have that up there so people could write it down. I did have the Mishnah of Vodazara up there, but I couldn't remember what you said for the Jerusalem Talmud. But even before we get to the Talmudic period, we still have, which the Talmudic period is 4th, 5th century, give or take. Well, more like closer to 5th. But we have, I see what you did there. Closer to the 5th century, but it's 4th and 5th. We still have something that predates the Talmud a little bit, don't we? On stuff like this.
So this is specific to the discussion regarding the trees, right? That's what you're referring to?
Actually, no.
I was going to go. By all means, you go with it. This is something that I don't think that I've got in my notes so far.
Yeah, you do. Yeah, you do. It's the next banner.
Yes. All right. So this one is actually, now I've pulled from this before. In particular, the statement where he acknowledges that the observance of the Christmas holiday is less than 10 years old in the region where he is at this point. Mm-hmm. Within that same paragraph, and I don't have the exact word for word quote from, but within that same paragraph, he basically makes a direct comparison of Yeshua to the sun. It reads something to the nature of the sun. Do you have it? Oh, please, yep. Please, by all means, read it.
On this day also, the birthday of Christ was lately fixed at Rome in order that while the heathen were busy with their profane ceremonies, the Christians might perform their sacred rites undisturbed. They call this December 25th, or 8th Cal Jan, as the Romans wrote it, the birthday of the invincible sun, but who is also invincible as the Lord. They call it the birthday of the solar disk, but Christ is the Son of righteousness. And he uses sun as an S-U-N of righteousness, which is from the Zechariah prophecy.
Right.
So he makes a direct connection with the sun worship and saying, well, that's their invincible sun. Well, our sun is also invincible. That's kind of the connection he makes there.
Right. And that's really, that's kind of how syncretism starts, right? Though that actually, that's exactly how syncretism works, is by trying to point out to the pagans that, well, like your God and our God are really kind of the same thing. So why don't you just do things our way? Right. or why don't we just like adopt your way of doing things, but we like word it a little bit different so it fits our practice a little better. But at its root, that is syncretism right there, folks. You just witnessed it.
Yeah. And that's the thing about it. This is, of course, John Chrysostom admitting that they are borrowing from a pagan festival. Like that's the thing about it too is, what we have is before about this time, and you go into a lot more detail about this in your article in part 3. That's on the website now. If you're a supporter, you have access to that. But essentially, he already admits that this festival is less than 10 years old as far as he's got it here in the same Natalim. But on top of that, John Chrysostom is the guy who would later go to big Catholic Church and convince them to adopt the December 25th date officially. He is the driver of the December 25th Christmas celebration as a whole. He's had it for about 10 years at this point, so that puts it about 376, 377 by his own admission. And then he would later go and push the Catholic Church to adopt that as the official date, because as of yet, the Catholic Church is bouncing around between November 18th and January 6th. And they didn't really have anything kind of solidified. And some still even thought of it as March 25th or April time frame.
November 18th.
No solidified. Yeah, nothing was set in stone yet. And so John Chrysostom would actually be the guy who would go to the church and convince them to adopt the December 25th date. And if you're wondering where I'm getting that information from, it's in the Catholic Encyclopedia. By their own admission, it's written in their documents, and you can look up Christmas, and they actually have a detailed overview of how they came about Christmas. And John Chrysostom is essentially the front runner for the whole thing, and they give it in great detail, and they admit very readily that it was not originally their idea. It was more of a pagan thing that they just kind of adopted and claimed for themselves. Now, again, that's in the Catholic encyclopedias, much later written. There's no evidence directly that points to this direct adoption, but by all accounts, the Catholics are willing to say, yeah, we think we adopted it. And so whether or not they have proof of it or not, they're basically willing to just say, yeah, we did. Whether it's true or not, they're willing to take it. So
absolutely.
That's it for my 2 cents. I had that pulled up ready to go.
Yep. Our next stop in the historical timeline is going to be
You going to Pope Leo?
Yeah, somewhere between 50, 60 years later. Pope Leo the First, in his sermon 22 on the Feast of the Nativity, part 6. Now, in this, what he outlines is an acknowledgement of the presumed coincidence between the celebration of the Nativity and the celebration of the winter solstice. Mm-hmm. So the exact quote here is, "Having therefore so confident a hope, dearly beloved, abide firm in faith in which you are built, lest that same temper whose tyranny over you Christ has already destroyed win you back again with any of his wiles, and mar even the joys of the present festival by his deceitful heart, misleading simpler souls with the pestilential notion of some to whom this our solemn feast day seems to derive its honor, not so much from the nativity of Christ as, according to them, from the rising of the new sun. Such men's hearts are warped in total darkness and have no growing perception of the true light, for they are still drawn away by the foolish errors of heathendom. And because they cannot lift the eyes of their mind above that which their carnal sight beholds, they pay divine honor to the luminaries that minister to the world. Let not Christian souls entertain any such wicked superstition and portentous lie." So he is not only acknowledging here that the winter solstice is celebrated on the same day that he celebrates the Nativity. One of the other things, again, to go back to the fact that you don't have to tell people not to do something that they're not doing. Right. He's again telling Christians not to engage in that same celebration with the heathens, which tells us what?
That they were.
They're doing. And that actually continues. And
is this for your next banner? Because I want to bring up one thing before we move on.
Go for it.
Okay. Because this is part of the dogmatic part, right? Now, there are some who would assert that Christians started keeping Christmas first, and the pagans copied them and created a solstice holiday because the Christians were doing it and because it was popular with the Christians. That's more speculative than to simply admit that it was pagan first. Not only is there no evidence for that at all, period. So don't let anyone tell you otherwise. But again, we do have primary sources that admit that the lining up is, if nothing else, coincidental. But there is an admission of another holiday going on, that this thing is brand new, and that the pagans have their own thing on the same day. And so there's, at the very least, you have to concede that it's coincidence. But there's no evidence in any way to formulate even the idea that Christians were doing it first. It got super popular, and so the pagans copied it and they appropriated Christmas and turned it pagan. That's not how that happened at all. As I think by now we've established with the sources that we've been reading from the mouths of the church fathers themselves, that simply is not the case. And I just wanted to bring that up before we move on to the Gregory letter.
Right. Well, and look, that being the case, right? What we've gone over so far is we're not seeing, to add, to restate really what you just said. We're not seeing the church fathers reference these pagan celebrations in any way that they are new. Right? They're not talking about these as though they are new. They are talking about the celebration of the Nativity as though it's new.
Mhm.
But they're talking about these pagan celebrations in the reality that they have been long-standing, right? These pagan celebrations have existed for quite some time, and that can be historically observed and confirmed in numerous regions of the world. So again, the idea that like pagans started doing it because they got the idea from Christians, unfortunately, then we have to rationalize winter solstice celebrations that exist and have existed for millennia in parts of the world that Christianity really hasn't had that much of an effect.
Right. Well, we just know prior to Christianity's very foundation, even you could even argue prior to Judaism's founding at the Exodus, we have solstice holidays, particularly the winter and the summer solstices. And it's generally speaking accepted widely that pagans celebrate a winter solstice as the sort of birthday of the sun god in some fashion. And now on our current calendars, just to clarify, the winter solstice is, I think, December 28th. On the Julian calendar, which was the calendar at the time before Pope Gregory would create the Gregorian calendar and fix some of the problems that the Julian calendar had, it was on December 25th. That was the solstice every year.
Which Epiphanius confirmed.
Now, again, it's speculation that Aurelius dedicated the temple on the 25th of December to Sol Invictus. However, that speculation doesn't stretch nearly as far as Christmas predating pagan celebration of solstice. Because the reason scholars think that is because we all know pagans celebrate the winter solstice, and Sol Invictus is a sun god, and that temple was built in 270, 274 AD. It's very likely that if it wasn't dedicated on that day, that in and about and in around the solstice, if not on the solstice, we know that they would be celebrating some sort of Sol Invictus festival immediately following the Saturnalia, which is kind of in tandem. There's a lot of holidays in the winter because there's nothing else to do in the winter when you're part of an agrarian culture. The winter is for settling down mostly. Summer is for work. So the speculation you have to make, the logical jump between Saturnalia, Sol Invictus coming first, and then the history of religions concept kicks in, and Christianity uses it as an attempt to provide a substitute to the pagan holidays, which is actually likely what was going on. They weren't trying to appropriate necessarily pagan customs and be syncretic. They probably were trying to offer a substitute for these holidays in an attempt to draw pagans away from them and into Christianity. But what inevitably ends up happening is obviously some of those customs migrate along with that transfer as more pagans do move into the Christian family, and they keep a lot of that baggage with them as they convert. That's just what happens. That's observable history and basically fact. And that's the point we're trying to make, though, is it's one of those things that probably started with good intentions, but there's also no smoking gun. But there's a lot of there's a lot of reason the speculation isn't at that far. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah. I would equate it to the speculation that the first Christmas was in 336, right? Which is speculation, right? There's no admission to that being the case. Some scholars who hold to the calculations theory assume that because there's no martyrs mentioned after that date, that they must have started celebrating Christmas at that date. So sure, that's a speculation. We know that Sol Invictus was celebrated on December 25th, and then we know that in 274 AD his temple was erected. And would have been dedicated. It's not really that far of a leap to presume that the dedication would have taken place on the day that they would have celebrated Sol Invictus, being December 25th.
Yeah.
So it's I would call them equals in how much speculation is required to come to that conclusion. However, I would agree, given what we went over in part 2, right, that the whole basing the calculation of his birth on the idea that he died on March 25th, which we established was highly improbable and implausible.
It was likely April 3rd.
Right. And then concluding from that, the date of December 25th, seems like those dates were already pre-selected, one being the vernal equinox, the other one being the winter solstice. It's more likely that that is the case, right? The church fathers acknowledging that these days are important to pagans, needing to come up with a substitute, the idea of the rebirth of the sun, tying that, as we see John Chrysostom do, with the Son of Righteousness, right? Making that allegorical shift helps you to derive the basis for a substitute, right? That is not in any way far-fetched speculation. That is using the evidence that we have to form a conclusion, right? That's 2 + 2 is 4 very easily.
Well, it's if anything else, it might not be 2 + 2 is 4. It might be 2 + X is 4. And we're going, well, X must be 2 because it equals 4. So, yeah.
That being said,
yeah, here's where it gets dirty. All right. So everybody break your notebooks out now and start writing stuff down.
we get a blatant, not even just admission, a blatant order to synchronization.
Yep.
This is where Pope Gregory the First's letter to Augustine comes in. Okay. This is the letter where, and we've read this in, I think, part 1. I think we read
Did we read it in part 1?
We may have. I don't know. We read it in one of them, but I will go ahead and read it again. Okay.
I don't know. It's a good read.
So Pope Gregory writes to Augustine in 597 AD. He says, "Tell Augustine that he should by no means destroy the temples of the gods, but rather the idols within those temples. Let him, after he has purified them with holy water, place altars and relics of the saints in them. For if those temples are well built, they should be converted from the worship of demons to the service of the true God. Thus, seeing that their places of worship are not destroyed, the people will banish error from their hearts and come to places familiar and dear to them in acknowledgement and worship of the true God. Further, since it has been their custom to slaughter oxen in sacrifice, they should receive some solemnity in exchange. Let them, therefore, on the day of the dedication of their churches, or on the feast days of the martyrs whose relics are preserved in them, build themselves huts around their one-time temples and celebrate the occasion with religious feasting. They will sacrifice and eat animals, not anymore as an offering to the devil, but for the glory of God, to whom, as the giver of all things, they will give thanks for having been satiated." So, what do we learn from that, Seamus?
Good intentions, bad judgment.
It's what's interesting, actually. If you go on further reading in I can't remember if it's that letter or because there's a series of correspondence that pertain to this topic. There is a huge dispute mentioned over the burning of a synagogue that took place right in this same time frame, and whether or not it was proper to punish those who did it. So again, this is a time where basically, from what I gathered from the letter, the Pope kind of gives those who burned the synagogue the pass because they were doing the right thing
by exterminating Judaism.
Right. Whereas
But
it
God
seems
forbid you exterminate paganism.
right.
Yeah.
And it seems that Augustine rather was serving true justice and had intended to serve justice to those who did it. So it just, again, we're kind of seeing in tandem with one another here the celebration of Christmas, the syncretism of pagan holidays with Christian observance, and alongside it, persecution of Jews. Those two don't ever really seem to leave one another's side, not until the late 1800s.
And even then, we really don't see a real change in Christianity's attitude towards Judaism until after the Holocaust.
Yes.
Until after Christianity kind of took a look at itself and went, wow, is that what our theology is capable of? There's a lot of history behind the Reformation.
More than that, because there were those who, at least as far as their understanding of the Old Testament goes, saw a similarity with the scale of persecution to judgments on Israel that we see rendered, throughout the times of the prophets. And that gave them pause, right? Because up to that point, the idea in Christianity was that the church was the new Israel, right? The church was God's new people. And so if God only chastises the child whom he loves, it like that whole moment in history gave the church pause, and it really weighed in on that. Well, the Jews probably actually are still God's people. Otherwise, why? Right?
Yeah, that's when we see the birth of modern Messianic Judaism as we know it.
Yes.
Comes shortly thereafter. Now, Messianic Judaism has been around for a while. We did an episode on that. It's actually been around for an incredibly long time. But Messianic Judaism, as you know it today, was born basically post the Holocaust, right out of the 60s and 70s, as Protestantism was taking a look at itself after what had happened.
Yep.
So, once again, with Pope Gregory to Augustine, good intentions, bad judgment, and it was sort of an inevitable thing. And that's where we say that, we have a pattern that we're establishing here with all these things. Throughout history, nothing is changing. It's kind of all the same stuff. But as time goes forward, we have more details about what's going on and why these things are going on. Whereas in the past, writing was rare anyway, and so those details are more rare, but the pattern we can establish is the same, more or less.
The other thing here to notice is, well, like you said, nothing's really changing. Okay, so we know that in the time of Tertullian, there was a problem of Christians taking part in pagan festivals. Then, after we see the development of Christmas as a holiday, we know that it doesn't really become very widespread until about the time of Augustine. But even at that point, we still don't see a clear break from pagan tradition. We still have the problem of Christians engaging in and being somewhat confused by the coincidence, we can call it, of pagan tradition with their own and how closely they resemble one another. And that brings us to our next bit of evidence here, which comes, so we are now into the 8th century, right? Yeah. Which is important because we've referenced a few times now the Haggadah of Shimon Kefa, which is an 8th century document.
Yeah.
So now Christmas has finally caught up to it as far as our timeline goes. And interesting here is that Boniface actually rebukes Pope Zacharias Pope Zacharias is reproaching Boniface, who was the Archbishop of Germany at this point. And he's rebuking him for the behavior of Christians in Rome. and the obstacle that they are presenting to those who are trying to convert the heathens into Christianity throughout Europe. Essentially what he's saying is that the Christians in Rome are acting as a bad witness, essentially. The reason for this is because of the confusion about the observance of Christmas at this point. The exact quote here, he says, because the sensual and ignorant Alemannians, Bavarians, and Franks see that some of these abuses which we condone are rife in Rome. They think that the priests there allow them. Let me come down. And that on that account they reproach us and take bad example. They say that in Rome, near the church of St. Peter, they have seen throngs of people parading in the streets at the beginning of January each year, shouting and singing songs in pagan fashion, loading tables with food and drink from morning till night, and that during that time no man is willing to lend his neighbor fire or tools or anything useful from his own house. They recount also that they have seen women wearing pagan amulets and bracelets on their arms and legs and offering them for sale. All such abuses witnessed by sensual and ignorant people bring reproach upon us here and frustrate our work of preaching and teaching. Of such matters the apostles say reprovingly, you have begun to observe special days and months, special seasons and years. I am anxious over you. Has all the labor I have spent on you been useless? So here he quotes Galatians 4:10. Interestingly enough, not in the fashion that we hear Christians
usually quoted
use it today against observing Torah. He's it in the way that Paul intended it, right? Rebuking Christians for taking part in pagan practice.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And what's when he mentions the Church of St. Peter, something else that is noted in particular about that is one of the things that could be observed is people waiting on the steps before entering the church to pay homage to the sun. And both Christian and pagan alike were doing this, right? Hence the confusion, right? That Christians would wait on the steps, pay homage to the sun before entering the church. That again just stands as evidence of the syncretism that we're kind of getting to at this point.
There's a long history of it.
And so finally we're getting a little closer to Alexander Hislop in the 1800s. Our next example of an acknowledgement of the inherent paganism involved in in Christmas practice in the early Christian church comes from Increase Mathers in 1687.
Which is probably my favorite name in all of history. That's just who names their kid Increase?
Right?
What a cool name.
How do you figure that he went on to name his son Cotton?
It's just Increase Mathers. It sounds like you're not saying a name. It sounds like you're trying to say something.
Right.
Anyway, go on.
In his particular work, I did not put the title of it in a banner because it is far too long to put in a banner.
Oh, this is back in the day when titles were entire sentences. Yeah.
Yes. So
I'm guilty of doing this.
Is a testimony against several profane and superstitious customs now practiced by some in New England, and evil whereof is evinced from the Holy Scriptures and from the writings of both ancient and modern divines. This is from chapter 3, pages 18 and 19, respectively. where Increase Mathers acknowledges that the Christmas holiday is Saturnalia. He says the exact same thing as Epiphanius, even cites Epiphanius, that Christmas comes from Saturnalia. Again, there's a problem of dates there, which we addressed with the Mishnah, which establishes that the problem of dates is not really a problem of dates, because we do this to this day, right? The legal holiday of Saturnalia, legal holiday, in other words, the government sanctioned period of the holiday, was from December 17th to December 23rd, 24th, respectively. So legally, the Christmas holiday is just December 25th. That's it. But Seamus, how many Christians do you know who don't treat December 24th, Christmas Eve, as an equal holiday in and of itself?
Well, in Europe, we don't do Christmas morning stuff usually. Like in European tradition, you just stay up until midnight and open presents at midnight. You don't do the wake up at 6 a.m., you know, and open presents first thing in the morning when you're trying to sleep in on a holiday. So it is it's a whole weekend event, and plus you have family coming to visit, or you're going to visit. So anywhere between December 22nd and December 27th is probably like your typical Christian. This is Christmas for us because, you know, my mom was finally able to make it in town this day or whatever. And yeah,
I would actually say, especially in America, Christmas is extended to New Year's.
Yeah.
The holiday just rolls right into New Year's.
Yeah, even for the Marine Corps, we have a joke. After the Marine Corps birthday, nothing gets done for the rest of the year. Because 10 November, you have the Marine Corps birthday, then you have Veterans Day, then you have Thanksgiving. And so like all these 4-day weekends are back to back, and then Christmas and the New Year's and everything. And so it's like nothing gets done in the Marine Corps after the birthday of the Marine Corps, because everything just ceases until New Year's, and then we pick back up where we left off.
Well, and it's interesting, right? Because, I mean, it makes perfect sense that we do it today. This is really, it's human nature, right? I mean, how many of us started getting in the Hanukkah spirit and decorating for Hanukkah before it was actually Hanukkah? You know, it's just part of human nature to celebrate a holiday before it's really that holiday.
Yeah, the anticipation. Yeah.
Right. So, and not only that, when you have two holidays that are close enough together, like Christmas and New Year's, we have that tendency to just roll one into the other, right? So when you have Saturnalia in that proximity to the winter solstice, it really isn't that far of a leap to just assume that human nature was the same back then. And they just rolled one holiday into the other, which again, the Mishnah confirms they did.
Yeah. Which the Mishnah, by the way, predates the Epiphanius.
Yes.
Epiphanius.
Yes.
I'm going to stick with Hebrew. But
yeah, Epiphanius, you know, that's 377 AD. Mishnah is, you know, at a like late
200 to 300. Yeah. So, and then the Talmud comes shortly thereafter. Well, I should say the Gemara comes shortly after the Mishnah. So from about 350, 400, finally it's Talmudic completion and somewhere around 500. But yeah.
It's also entirely likely that that's how Saturnalia became extended in the first place, right? It started as a one-day festival, but people kept celebrating it for days after it was over, so they just decided to extend it, and then they extended it again, and then they extended it again. And it's very likely that by the time Christianity came around, it was about to be extended again.
I mean, well, so we have this idea, the Philocalian calendar does put Sol Invictus on December 25th as a holiday. And that's a calendar that dates to 350. So, you know, it's not really speculation to say that to go from Saturnalia and then just roll right into Sol Invictus and kind of just meld the two holidays more or less together. There's less than 100 years of difference between. It's like maybe 80 years of difference between the Sol Invictus building of the Sol Invictus temple to that calendar, mentioning the Sol Invictus being specifically on that day. It's not the time difference is about as much as the time difference between the Gospels being written and Jesus being living. Yeah.
Right. All that to kind of come around here, because we're right here over the hour so far.
Yeah.
The idea that the idea that Christmas is pagan is not a new idea by any means. At the very least, it goes back to Epiphanius, right? But as we saw, there is evidence to support that theory that goes back even farther. And that's the other thing to point out about everything we've gone over tonight. When people tell you that there is zero evidence, there is no evidence that Christmas is pagan, what they're talking about is a smoking gun, all right? There is nobody in church history who said, yeah, we took this holiday and turned it into Christmas, okay? But there's also no evidence that Christmas predates any pagan holiday. Right.
Yeah, there's no evidence on either side for that smoking gun evidence. There's no like primary document that says, "Yep, we borrowed it," or "Yeah, they stole it," or "Yeah, we stole." There's none of that.
Right.
We have a bunch of puzzle pieces that fit fairly well together. The 2 + X = 4. What could X possibly be? Kind of thing.
Right. Everything we've gone over so far, tonight especially, is evidence of a pagan origin in Christmas, right?
From the mouths of Christians themselves.
Yes. Not only evidence of a pagan origin in Christmas, but an evidence of a belief that it had pagan origins going long before Alexander Hislop and the two Babylons. We really have only appealed to primary sources here. You guys all have the sources. If you want to see how these particular sources and these citations line up with the dates which the births were guessed on, and then the dates that the celebration of the Nativity began on, then you can go back to the other two parts and you can compare those dates, and you can kind of see that there's a particular point in time where this struggle coagulates history, right? There's a point where it's not a problem, and then there's a point where it's a big problem, and then there's a point where it's not a problem, right? So, because that's a pretty big time gap from 742 all the way to 1687. That roughly, I would say, represents the time frame when Catholicism had so much power that to suggest that Christmas was pagan, you would be executed for it. So, of course, we don't find evidence for it until after the Reformation.
I was going to say, and even the reformers themselves, their thought was, and this is why they didn't celebrate Christmas at all. John Calvin, I don't believe, celebrate Christmas. If he was going to give a sermon on Christmas Sunday, it wouldn't be a Christmas specific sermon. He just didn't care for it. For them, it was at worst it's pagan, at best it's Catholic. So we're not Catholics and we're not pagans, so we have no reason to celebrate the Christmas holiday. I mean, it was by the Puritans banned in America in the late 1600s. Increase Mathers. And so we actually have, like, throughout Christian history, the dominant position has been it's probably pagan. It's really not until recently where the suggestion has been expropriation rather than appropriation. Appropriation is to adopt, right? To take on. Expropriation is to accuse the pagans of taking our thing, right? So that's when you say that's an expropriation. So that the idea is throughout Christian history, it's been everyone more or less just acknowledged it and just took it for a fact, even if it wasn't necessarily fact. It was like, well, but the evidence though. And so Yeah, this is a fairly recent thing, and it's also why, but in complete fairness, that's why we're doing this series here. One, you can decide for yourself what you think, given the evidence. You can go and look it up and come to your own conclusion. But secondly, neither side has any leg to stand on to be dogmatic about either of these topics. The idea being that one side certainly has a stronger position, in our opinion. And that's the opinion, of course, that Christians probably shouldn't keep Christmas, but we also don't tell you what you can and can't do. We're not ones to tell you can't keep Christmas because it's pagan. That would be a little bit disingenuous on our part, mostly because, again, we don't really necessarily have a smoking gun. So the purpose of this show was mostly to, I guess, squelch the dogmatism, right? To tell both sides, listen, there's no reason to be dogmatic about this at all.
It's why I brought it back around to the bold claim that there is no evidence that Christmas is pagan. That's obviously not true, right? And then for people who want to say, well, you just haven't read all of these documents. You haven't read all of the early church fathers. Well, no, I have. We have. That's why we still think this. There's no world in which you read the church fathers and magically come to the conclusion that Christmas is not pagan. In fact, a lot of people come to the conclusion that Christmas was pagan specifically because they have read the church fathers. And they have read many of the statements of such that we have posted and cited here from primary sources. There is a lot of evidence for it. There's no specific smoking gun. That's not how evidence works. You wouldn't need evidence if there was a smoking gun. Which is the other thing to address, right? When you say there's no evidence of something, like what are we really talking about? If you're asking for a smoking gun, then you're not actually asking for evidence, right? Evidence is data that has to be collected and pieced together in order to form a conclusion. A fact is a fact, right? If you're a smoking gun is what we would call a fact, right? But evidence is what we have demonstrated here, and there's an amount of evidence for both sides. I would say I think the stronger evidence is in one direction.
Yeah, it's one of those. I mean, if you were to put it in a court of law, you would have to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt. And depending on the judge, it could go one way or the other. So that's why we present it to you guys and just kind of let you take it from there for yourselves. Yeah, the whole, like, don't get us wrong. We're not saying you can't celebrate the birthday of the Messiah. If anything, there's certainly some precedence for which to do something like that. Mm-hmm. There might not be precedence in early church history because the Jews never did it, and so the first Christians never did it either. But that's not to say you can't. And so, feel free to celebrate a nativity of some sort. And, honestly, feel free to do it on the 24th or 25th, at your own conscience, as your own conscience will allow you to do. But we're not saying you can't celebrate a birthday of the Messiah in some fashion. That's not what we're trying to say. We are simply trying to establish that the particular birthday celebration that has been attributed to him for the last 1700 years is a little sus, and maybe we should think about, as Christians, maybe moving away from that, or not totally moving away from it, but letting the secular world kind of have its thing, and we can still use that as a tool for witness. We can still utilize it, but again, good intentions, bad judgment. You have to be careful with how you're, doing a substitution versus accidentally synchronizing. I think Yeshua summed up what you're talking about rather beautifully, and when he said, "Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's," right? And there are some who take issue with that. They'll say, "Well, I won't concede anything that is Christian to the pagans." Well, the point here is that we can't really establish with any sense of certainty that it's uniquely Christian. Rather, the evidence that we can examine would suggest that it is Caesar's and therefore should be rendered unto him. Yeah, and there's nothing really necessarily wrong with celebrating secular holidays. Thanksgiving is not a biblical holiday. But again, it's one of those you have to, at your own conscience, whenever you're ready. Can't force you to do nothing, but I just wanted to make it clear that what we're not saying is you can't celebrate like a birthday. Personally, and I think I speak for the both of us when I say this, we observe in a sort of sense the birth of the Messiah during Sukkot.
Yes,
It's usually during Sukkot when we're celebrating Sukkot, and then we go, oh, by the way, Jesus was probably born this day, and we use that as a witnessing tool for other people. I invite people to my sukkah and show them the things and go over the history and open up Luke chapters, 1 and 2 and Matthew and stuff. And I think it speaks way better for itself if you just let the biblical holidays speak for themselves than to have all this, materialism and pretty, maybe not so obvious, but pretty dubiously obvious signs of paganism and try to mold that into the shape of Jesus rather than just letting the shape of Jesus take its own form in the Bible as it's written, through the holidays already as it is. You don't have to force him. You don't have to shoehorn Jesus into the holidays. He's there already. But you do have to kind of shoehorn him into this pagan solstice style stuff. Now it's not you can't use it necessarily, but it's not quite the same. We should probably rethink how we approach this season, I think.
Right. It's not exactly organic.
Yeah. So that's just me. That's just me.
Yeah. I agree. I'm especially for those who are ignorant, and I think that we need to have more grace for people who are ignorant, right? To come at somebody sideways who obviously doesn't know any of the information that we've gone over tonight, or in the last 3 parts, and tell them, well, you're committing idolatry. That's not a good way to go about that.
Yeah. There's also no reason to be an a-hole about, you know what I mean? Like basically what you're saying, but specifically about like, this is something that I do, and you can disagree with me all you want, you in the audience, or even you, Brad. But if somebody wishes me a happy Christmas or a Merry Christmas, I'm from Europe, so say happy Christmas. Generally, especially if it's like during Hanukkah, I'll say, oh, happy Christmas to you and happy Hanukkah. And I like kind of like reciprocate. 'Cause they were kind enough to, they think I'm a Christian, probably. There's nothing wrong with that thought. And they're just wishing me a good time for the holidays. Okay, happy Christmas to you. And happy Hanukkah if you celebrate it. If not, that's like my little nudge. Like, I celebrate Hanukkah, but happy Christmas to you. There's nothing wrong with being friendly. You don't got to be an a-hole. Be like, well, I'm not going to say happy Christmas because it's pagan. And, you don't got to be that guy. Okay. Just, calm down. It's okay. Not everyone knows this stuff. And you're going to turn a lot of people off to the whole concept real quick if you go the wrong way anyway. Yeah.
Right. No, I would agree 100%. That's kind of it's been my approach. And it actually adds a level of respect for people who understand. And so they say happy holidays instead. I understand for years that was a whole, there's a war on Christmas. They're trying to take Jesus out of it. And it's like, well, I don't know if they're trying to take him out of it, but you guys are still trying to put him into it.
Zing.
There's no war on Christmas because they're still celebrating Christmas. They just understand that this season is a season in which many different religions have a holiday, which again stands as evidence of what we've been talking about. The fact that there are so many religions that do have a holiday that they celebrate in this season.
Yeah. And on top of that, New Year's is right next to it. So it's oftentimes happy holidays just means happy Christmas and New Year's, but truncated.
Right. It's a cover-all in case I don't see you between Christmas and New Year's.
If I don't see you for the rest of the year. Yeah.
Right. So yeah, it's if you are a Christmas celebrating Christian, have a little grace for people who phrase it as happy holidays, because they're trying to respect everybody. They don't mean any particular inherent disrespect to you, but they're trying to respect everybody. Maybe respect everybody else in return, the same way that we're also telling our Torah observers, look, just respect and wish goodwill back,
Yeah, for the holiday thing, if you get it, and you're a Christmas celebrator, just respond, Happy Christmas and Happy Holidays to you too. 'Cause then you covered both. You've made it plain that you're a Christmas celebrator, but you're also making sure that maybe they're Jewish and they just wished you a Happy Christmas, but they're over at their home lighting a Hanukkah menorah. So just extend a little grace on the other side too. Not everyone you talk to is a Christian. That's just the way that it is.
And on that note, we do hope you all had a lovely Hanukkah.
Yes.
Unfortunately, I was unable to be home for the 8th night because I was in Savannah, Georgia. But I did have a good 8th night nonetheless. It was a good time spent with family, and it was just away from my immediate family. My wife and daughter were not able to come with us for the journey, but I got to spend time with my many brothers. So it was a time for the boys. That was good.
Nice.
And I hope everybody watching had a wonderful Hanukkah. I feel like Hanukkah might have been the only holiday that really felt like a holiday this year.
Yeah, I had a good, unfortunately, my better half is away in some classes and training. And so I spent all of Hanukkah just myself and my father, though. So I've spent a lot of time, kind of making up for lost times, hanging out with my dad, which has been a blessing all on its own. Just me and the boys, me and him kind of catching up on a lot of years of missed out because he was in Japan for a very long time. And yeah, so I too had a great, and he had a lot of questions and we talked a lot about the holiday and the significance and why it's important to me. And he was very inquisitive. It was a great time. Actually, I had a blast. So
wonderful. So, I think for now that concludes, the Deck the Halls with Dogmatism series. We may add some parts in the future. Maybe next year we'll go into detail on some of the specific traditions, such as mistletoe, the Christmas tree, the Yule log, what have you.
Might be worth doing.
Yeah, maybe we'll revisit it next year. But for now.
But don't forget, real quick, all of these episodes have a corresponding article on our website it is a member exclusive. It's basically the script, but with a lot more detail, and all the sources and everything are listed.
Yes.
Like I said, part 3's article I love it. It's easily my favorite one so far. And so there's going to be one for this one as well. So if you want access to some of that stuff, as well as a bunch of other exclusive content that we have on the website, consider being a member. Membership starts at $1 a month.
Absolutely. And if you've enjoyed this, don't be afraid to hit the like and subscribe button. Ring the bell if you want to know when we get some new content up. There is always new content coming, and maybe even more new content coming. We're networking a few ideas. Always stuff coming up on the website too. Got a lot more coming for the website here in the future.
Yes.
That being said, we hope that this has enlightened you and blessed you in some way. Hope that it hasn't offended you too much.
I don't care either way. Be offended.
Right. Yeah. But we hope that you will join us again next week for another discussion on another topic. We'll put the Christmas tree to rest for the rest of the year, I suppose. And again, join us in the after parties if you are a member. If you are not a paying member, then you should consider becoming a paying member so that you can join us in the after parties. You can talk about what we discussed tonight, or something from one of the previous episodes, or something that you have a question about in the articles, something about Hanukkah from last week's episode.
Or if you want to know what we're about to do in the future, we often get in the after parties and tell our members.
You guys get a sneak peek of everything because we're so excited to tell you what our ideas are.
Yeah. You guys know way ahead of time, and we're going to do something big. So
absolutely. But that being said, we will see all of you who will join us in the after parties. And, l'chaim.
Time.